She was standing at a casino slot machine the exact moment her daughter stopped breathing. Not stopped, almost stopped. The moment a truck ran a red light and changed everything about how a family would pretend to love each other. My name is Paige Tanner. I'm 34 years old, and the thing my family never expected me to do is this: turn the proof into a weapon. But here's what you need to understand first. This isn't a story about revenge. This is a story about the moment you finally understand, really understand, that being needed and being loved are not the same thing. 6 weeks earlier, I'd given birth to my daughter, Nora. She was perfect, small, quiet, the kind of baby that didn't ask for much except to be held. Then a truck ran a red light on Highway K-Fax at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. And everything I thought I knew about my family got rewritten in the time it took for me to wake up in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a cast that made my right arm feel like it belonged to someone else. My husband was in Seattle, 6 hours away. My newborn daughter needed someone to care for her that night. And my mother, the woman who'd raised me, who I'd been quietly bleeding dry for 9 years, said one sentence that I will hear in my head until the day I die. Your sister never has these emergencies. What happened in the next 9 days will teach you something about the difference between being the strong one in a family and being the one they've decided can carry everything forever. And what I did from that hospital bed, what I built, what I uncovered, what I finally let them see, cost my family $486,000 and gave me back my life. Welcome to Hidden Family Revenge. I'm Paige Tanner, and this is how I closed the account. Let me take you back to 11:47 p.m., Highway K-Fax, eastbound. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital where I worked in medical billing, 12-hour shifts, the kind that break your lower back and your attention span. I'd been doing this work for 3 months since Nora was born, since my maternity leave had become financial necessity disguised as choice. My eyes were doing that thing where they don't quite focus, the kind of tired where the road looks like it's breathing. The truck came from the north intersection. Later, the police report would say the driver ran the light at approximately 45 miles per hour. No brake marks, no attempt to slow down. I never saw it. What I remember is the sound. Not the impact, the sound before impact. The moment my brain recognized something was wrong. A horn blaring. The pitch of tires that knew they were too late. Then compression. 3 things happened to my body in the next 2.3 seconds. 1. The steering wheel broke my ribs, 3 of them, in a neat line. 2. The dashboard impact punctured my left lung. 3. My right arm took the brunt of the airbag deployment, fracturing at 3 points. What happened to my mind was slower. Darkness, the sound of someone screaming. Later, it was me. I came up out of anesthesia in a curtained bay in the ER at 2:14 a.m. The first thing I felt was the weight, cast on my right arm, heavy, foreign, like carrying someone else's grief. The plastic ID band on my left wrist. Patient ID, 4738296. Not a person anymore, a number on a chart. A nurse was saying my name. She'd said it before, multiple times. The way medical professionals do when they're checking if you're coherent enough to understand what happens next. Paige, can you hear me? I heard her. What I felt was the weight of my ribs. Someone had parked a sedan on my chest. The kind of pain that makes you afraid to breathe, because breathing means the pain gets to do laps around your nervous system. And then, from the pillow beside my head, came Daniel's voice. He was on speaker, on FaceTime or a phone call. I couldn't quite focus on which one, but I could hear the flatness in his voice, that careful, controlled tone men use when they're terrified and trying not to sound terrified. Paige, the sitter can't stay past 11. I called your mom. I knew before he said the next part. I knew. She won't come. Behind his voice, I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the electronic chime of a slot machine paying out, the ambient noise of people cheering somewhere in the background. My mother was at Black Hawk Casino, not at home, not on her way to the hospital, at a casino, playing slots, while my 6-week-old daughter needed someone to hold her through the night. Daniel's voice cracked as he told me what my mother had said, word for word, because he knew I'd want it exact. I really can't drive over, Daniel. Megan's on a cruise, and someone has to watch the cat. Plus, you know Paige, she always lands on her feet. A cat. My newborn daughter needed her grandmother, and the answer was a cat. Not even a sick cat, just a cat. Here's the thing about crisis that nobody prepares you for. Most people expect you to fall apart. The woman in the hospital bed, the new mother, the one who just got hit by a truck. You're supposed to cry, to scream, to demand answers. I didn't. I looked at the ID band on my wrist. I looked at my left hand, the only functional one I had, and something in my mind did something very cold and very clear. It switched. Later, a therapist would call this dissociation. I called it, it's handled. I told Daniel the sitter situation was my problem to solve, not his, not my mother's. She'd already made her choice, mine. I spent the next 45 minutes on the phone with my left thumb, setting up a licensed overnight care agency. The woman who answered heard, hospital patient, newborn, emergency, and she moved with the kind of speed that comes from understanding what matters. 40 minutes later, a nurse named Yvette let herself into my house with the code Daniel gave her. She texted me a photo of Nora asleep, her tiny fist against her cheek. I looked at that photo for a long time, and I made a decision that my family still doesn't understand. The problem, my newborn needing care, I'd solved. The other problem, the one I'd been avoiding for 9 years, the one that lived in my banking app like a tumor I'd decided not to examine, that one was about to be addressed. To understand why this matters, you need to know who I was before that truck. Not the victim, not the woman lying in a hospital bed, the person, the one everyone counted on. I grew up in a rented duplex in Aurora, Colorado. The kind of neighborhood where the heat works when it feels like it, and nobody's surprised when it doesn't. My mother, Linda, was a woman who believed that wanting something hard enough was the same as working for it. My father, Roy, was a man who learned very early that the safest thing to do when your wife wanted something was to disappear into a newspaper and let her solve it. And my sister, Megan, born when I was 5 years old, came into the world with the kind of brightness that made my mother's whole face reorganize. I remember watching it happen. The moment my mother held her, something shifted. It was subtle. The way a light shifts when you're not supposed to notice it's changed, but I noticed. From that moment forward, I was the daughter who handled things. Megan was the daughter who was handled. It's a distinction that matters more than you think. By age 10, I was the one who made sure the light stayed on. Not literally, my parents did that, but emotionally, I was the ballast, the one who didn't need things, the one who could be counted on. When my mother got depressed after my sister was born, I was the one who watched Megan, not asked to, just did it. When my father's heart condition developed, I was the one who researched cardiologists, scheduled appointments, kept track of his medications. I was 12. By 15, I was working part-time at a grocery store, closing shifts at night, coming home to do homework at 11 p.m. By 18, I was paying for my own community college before I'd even graduated high school. And Megan? Megan had the world her mother wanted to give her. Piano lessons, art classes, the kind of childhood where someone else worries about whether the heat works. I didn't resent it, that's the trap. I didn't resent it because I'd decided, somewhere in my developing brain, that being needed meant being safe. If I was the load-bearing wall, nobody could remove me. If I was indispensable, I couldn't be abandoned. So I became more indispensable. I stopped asking for things. I became the person who solved problems. And when I got old enough to have money, I became the person who funded solutions. I met Daniel when I was 25. He was stable in the way I recognized, quiet, steady, the kind of person who doesn't need the world to rearrange itself for him to be content. We married at 26, and within a year, I started the transfers. The first one happened on a Tuesday night when my father called me, crying. His cardiologist had recommended a treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. The cost was $8,000. He was ashamed. I could hear it in his voice. The shame of being a man who couldn't provide. The shame of asking his daughter for help. I heard that shame, and I heard something else underneath it. Relief. Relief that someone would solve this for him, so he wouldn't have to figure it out himself. I set up a recurring transfer that night, $2,000 to my parents. For medical expenses, I told myself. For my father's health. And I never, not once in 9 years, asked what it was actually being used for. Because asking would have meant knowing, and knowing would have meant admitting what I'd become. Over 9 years, I sent my family $486,000. That's a number you have to sit with to understand. $486,000. It's almost $500,000. It's the down payment on a house. It's a college education for 3 children. It's a retirement fund. It's a life that didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the people I kept telling myself I was saving. And the worst part? I never once told my husband the total. When he'd ask about money, I'd say, "It's for my parents. It's necessary." And he trusted me. Because I'd built a reputation for being trustworthy. I was the one you could count on. The one who never asked for anything. The one who just handled it. Daniel had no idea that every month, I was quietly liquidating our future to fund my family's present. There was one person in my family who saw it. My grandmother, Ruth, my mother's mother. She was tall, flinty, the kind of woman who could command a room by being quiet in it. She smelled like coffee and machine oil. She managed her own finances, and she didn't apologize for asking questions. The year before she died, and I didn't know this until later, she got suspicious. She noticed my mother's spending, the new car, the casino mentions that were becoming more frequent. The way my mother had started talking about family money like it was something that existed in abundance. Ruth was old school. She believed in paying your own way. And something wasn't adding up. So she did what Ruth did. She started asking questions. My mother deflected. My father was silent. But Ruth kept digging, and eventually, she cornered my grandfather Harold and told him something that he didn't tell me until much later. Somebody is keeping Linda afloat. Find out who. Harold was a cattle rancher. He'd managed books for 40 years. He knew how to follow a number. He found me. He traced 9 years of transfers from a granddaughter he loved into a hole her mother kept digging. And he understood immediately what had happened. Not that I was naive, I was the opposite. I was responsible to the point of self-erasure. Ruth wanted to fix it before she died. She ran out of time. But she didn't give up. She did the only thing she could do. She called a lawyer. The ER nurse next to my bed asked if I had family who could come. It was 3 a.m. My daughter was safe. My husband was in the air. And I was lying in a hospital bed with a cast on one arm and the other arm finally free. For 9 years, I'd used my freedom to send money. For the first time, I was about to use it differently. I opened my banking app. The screen glowed in the darkness like a small, cold moon. Inside the app, there's a screen called Recurring Transfers, and I knew them by heart the way you know a scar. They'd been set up 9 years ago, and I'd never once looked at the total, because the total felt like a door I couldn't walk back through. But that night, I did something I'd been avoiding for a decade. I added up the total. Here's what the app told me when I finally asked it to tell the truth. Transfer 1. Mom and Dad. $2,000 per month. Recurring for 108 months. Total. $216,000. Transfer 2. Home. $1,200 per month. The mortgage I thought I was helping with. Total. $129,600. Transfer 3. Dad Medical. $900 per month. Heart treatment I never verified. Total. $97,200. Transfer 4. Megan Support. $500 per month. My sister's living expenses, though she'd never asked. Total. $54,000. Grand total. $486,000. The app did the math without flinching. No judgment, no hesitation. Just numbers telling the truth my emotions had been hiding from for 9 years. $486,000. Out of a life that wasn't mine to give away. I felt no triumph and no grief, just a strange flat clarity, like the moment a spreadsheet finally balances. Everything adds up, everything makes sense, and then something breaks. As I was closing the app, something caught my eye in the transaction history, a single line item buried under the Dad Medical label from 2 years ago. It read, Loan M, $40,000. M for Megan, except it wasn't a loan, loans get repaid. I pulled the original transfer notification, and it was filed under Dad's surgery to hide it inside the only category nobody questioned. My sister's initial, my sister's money. $40,000 that I'd sent thinking my father needed heart surgery. I sat there in the dark, listening to the monitor count my heartbeats, and I made myself sit with a question I'd avoided for 9 years. Why had I done this? The easy answer, the one strangers offer, is that I was a pushover. Desperate for love, naive. That answer is wrong. And if you've ever been the dependable one, the one everyone counted on, you already know why. I did it because I'd decided that being needed was the same as being safe. If I was the load-bearing wall, no one could remove me. My grandmother understood that about me before I did. The next morning, they moved me to a regular room. 3 hours later, my hospital room door opened slowly. My grandfather walked in. Harold, 78 years old, pressed flannel shirt, moving carefully with a cane he clearly resented. Under his arm, he carried a thick manila folder, soft and furred at the corners from age, bound with 2 crossed rubber bands gone brittle and pale from sitting in a file cabinet for a year, maybe longer. He set it on the foot of my bed, like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried a long way. And he said the thing I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. I knew. I always knew. He looked at me at the cast and the bruises, and waited for me to ask what he knew. About the money, he said. All 9 years of it. About where your mother's been spending her afternoons. About what she told this family while you bled yourself dry. He tapped the folder once. Not tonight, though. You've got enough tonight. We'll do this proper. In front of everyone. Where she can't squirm out the side door. And then he told me something that changed everything. He told me about my grandmother. That Ruth hadn't simply slipped away peacefully. That in her last year, she'd grown suspicious. That she'd found out about the casino. That she'd spent her last clear months with a lawyer, setting something in motion. And that whatever she'd set in motion, whatever was in that folder, had her signature on it, and his. A trust, Harold said. Set up the way Ruth and I set it. It does what we told it to do. And in this state, paperwork like that, it holds in court. Almost never fails. He stood, gathered the folder back under his arm, and before he left, he said something else that stopped my heart. She wasn't ashamed of you, Paige. Whatever your mother says, Sunday, when this comes out, your grandmother trusted you with everything. That's why she chose you. The day of the dinner, I did something I'd never done in 34 years. I told my mother no. Not in words. Words would have given her something to argue with. I told her no by staying silent. My mother had called 3 times in 2 days. First warm, then guilty, then sharp. Aunt Carol had texted a paragraph of borrowed outrage, so I'd sent her 1 printed page with 12 rows of numbers on it, and then nothing. Because numbers don't argue, they just sit there, being true. My mother wanted a family dinner, a reconciliation, a performance where I would play the grateful daughter, and she would play the wounded parent, and everyone would go home feeling like crisis had been averted. Except she didn't know about the folder. She didn't know that Harold had spent 40 years managing a cattle operations books, and he'd traced every dollar. She didn't know that her mother, my grandmother, had spent her last months locking something into place specifically to stop exactly what had been happening. On the drive to my parents' house, I made a decision about how this would play out. It would not be a screaming match. My mother is a virtuoso of volume. The moment I raised my voice, I would hand her the role she wanted. The hysterical, ungrateful daughter with a dozen witnesses to confirm it. So I wouldn't give her noise, I would give her paper. Here's the asymmetry. My mother's weapons were words, lies told warmly, guilt delivered on schedule, stories performed for relatives. My weapons were a single printed page, a screenshot in my husband's phone, and a folder in my grandfather's hands. She would shout. I would set down documents. She would perform. I would let the numbers be witnessed. And she would finally understand what I'd learned that night in the hospital bed. I had always been calm. I just finally stopped being silent, too. Megan called from the airport on Saturday, before the family dinner, and her voice told me everything about how little had changed while my world was being rebuilt from the foundation. Okay, so the cruise was kind of ruined, she announced, before asking if I was okay. I spent the whole time stressed about my card getting declined in front of people. Do you know how embarrassing that is? I held the phone and looked at Nora asleep in the crook of my good arm. This little life I'd nearly died for. This baby I'd almost abandoned funding a lie. And I asked my sister one question. Megan, where do you think that money comes from? There was a pause, the first real pause I'd ever heard from her. From Mom and Dad, she said. But it came out like a question, like she'd never actually been certain, but she'd never let herself ask. It's a family thing, she added. And that's where I left it. Because some bills you have to read yourself before you'll believe them. She had no idea what Sunday would teach her. The day before the dinner, Harold came to check on me. And I asked him the question I'd avoided my whole life. Why, Grandpa? Why did my mother spend 30 years treating one daughter like a prize and the other like a utility? He was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup. You have to understand how Ruth raised her, he said. And I braced, because I loved Ruth, and I didn't want her complicated. Ruth was a hard woman, Harold continued. Fair mostly, but hard. And she had a favorite. It wasn't your mother. It was your Uncle Danny, God rest him. I felt the floor tilt, because I knew that role. I had lived that role. Your mother grew up being the one who managed things, while Danny got the love, Harold went on. So when you were born, Paige, and you turned out steady and quiet and capable, just like she'd had to be, something in her couldn't stand it. And when Megan came along loud and needy and bright, your mother finally got to be the parent of the favorite instead of the forgotten one. He set down his coffee. The casino was the only place she ever felt like she might win something she hadn't had to earn. I understood my mother completely in that moment. I understood how pain gets passed down like a family recipe. How the person you become in response to your own abandonment becomes the person who abandons someone else. And how a woman, who was never asked to be anything but useful, decided to make one daughter useful and one daughter precious. And I was still done. We drove to my parents' house on Sunday. The house with the mortgage I'd believed I was paying for 9 years. I sat in the car for a moment, gathering myself. I still wore the cast, and around my wrist, I'd kept the hospital ID band from 5 days earlier, soft and gray now, faded. I peeled it off in the car finally, and tucked it into my coat pocket, because I wanted it on me during this conversation. A small, hard piece of proof of exactly where I'd been the night my mother chose a cat. Daniel carried Nora's car seat in his right hand, and from the curb behind us came the slow, careful tap of a cane. Harold, in his Sunday flannel. The worn manila folder pinned under his arm, with its brittle crossed rubber bands. You ready? He asked on the porch. Through the front window, I could see them all assembled. Aunt Carol, 2 cousins, my father in his chair, staring at nothing. My mother moving among them, topping off coffee, playing the wounded hostess. Queen of a kingdom I had financed without ever being crowned in it. Megan on the couch, scrolling her phone, sunburned, oblivious. I'm ready, I said. And I meant it in a way I never had before. Harold pushed the door open with the head of his cane. The 3 generations my mother least wanted in one room walked in. A baby, a cast, an ID band, a folder. The conversation stopped. My mother turned with the coffee pot in her hand, and her welcome smile already in place. Her eyes were already glistening for the audience, and she opened strong. She set down the coffee, pressed a hand to her chest, crossed the room toward Nora with the motion of a woman greeting her most precious grandchild. And Daniel angled the car seat away, gentle but immovable. The reach turned into a flutter, and then the performance began. She turned to the relatives, not to me. I am just so relieved we're all here. This has been the hardest week of my life. Her life, the week I spent in a hospital bed, nearly dead, had been the hardest week of her life. She told them, voice trembling on cue, that her daughter had suffered a little accident. Thank God, and had used it as an excuse to cut off her struggling parents, to abandon them in their old age, out of some imagined grievance. She dabbed her eyes. Aunt Carol nodded along, though I noticed she wouldn't quite look at me. And I knew she was thinking about those 12 rows, those numbers that don't lie. My father stared at his hands, and then my mother delivered her closer, the line she'd used to win every room for 30 years. The line she'd chosen to deploy while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. She turned at last to face me, with wet, wounded eyes, and a voice pitched perfectly for the cheap seats. I don't understand where this cruelty comes from. Your sister never has these emergencies." The fourth time in that warm, crowded room with everyone watching, she handed me the exact sentence she'd used to leave my newborn alone. And she had no idea she'd just loaded the gun and passed it to me grip first. The room waited for me to cry or shout or crumble. I did none of those things. I reached into the diaper bag beneath the wipes and took out one folded sheet of paper. I did not stand up and make a speech. I unfolded the single page, smoothed it flat against my thigh with my one good hand, and set it on the dining table in the middle of the room where the light from the fixture fell directly on it. Then I said, in the same level voice I used to present quarterly forecasts at a Fortune 500 company, "You're right, Mom. Megan never has these emergencies." I let that sit one beat. I'd like to show everyone why. I slid the page to the center. This is every dollar I sent this family for the last 9 years. $486,000. The room went very still. Carol leaned in despite herself. My cousins looked at each other. "The top rows are real," I continued. $65,000 for Dad's heart, his cardiologist, his prescriptions. $11,000 toward this mortgage. I let that sink in. The rest is the part Mom tells you all she manages on her own. I touched the page lightly, not for drama, just to guide their eyes. $290,000 in cash withdrawn over 9 years, almost all of it within 2 miles of the casino in Blackhawk. A small sound went around the room, an intake of breath, the sound of a story cracking wide open, and $120,000 to Megan, including $40,000 once filed under Dad's surgery so nobody would ask about it. My sister's head came up slowly. I looked at her and my voice stayed level. "That's where your card money comes from, Meg. It came from me. It always came from me." My mother's face was doing something I'd never seen it do. The wounded matriarch mask was simply falling off. Underneath was raw panic. Because the house she was standing in, the kingdom she ruled, had just been itemized on a single sheet of paper. She opened her mouth to speak, and that's when Harold set his cane against the table, and laid the manila folder down beside my single page. The brittle rubber bands had to be coaxed off. They'd been on so long they'd left grooves. He opened it with the unhurried hands of a man who had waited a year for this exact moment. And he spoke for the first time since we'd come in. His voice was quiet and dry, and somehow filled the room more than my mother's tears ever had. I knew. I always knew. He said it to the relatives, not to Linda. Ruth knew too. At the end, she had me trace it. He drew out a stapled document, official, thick. A Boulder law firm's name on the cover page. "This is your grandmother's trust, and mine. Last spring, Ruth and I moved most of what we had into it. The land, the accounts." He laid it out where everyone could see. "It does not go to Linda. Linda doesn't manage a dollar of it." He looked at my mother then, and there was no cruelty in it, only a tired final clarity. "We left it to Paige, and to the baby. There's a fund for Nora's schooling, the rest is in trust, the way Ruth wanted, where it can't be gambled away." He tapped the cover. "My attorney says it stands. We made good and sure it stands." What happened next is the part people always hope will be an apology, and it never is. My mother did not say she was sorry. She cycled through everything else first. She wept loud and sudden. When the room didn't soften, she pivoted to my father. "Roy, are you going to let them do this to me? This was your mess too." For one moment, I really thought, he might finally stand up. His mouth opened, he lifted his head and looked at me. "Paige is right," he whispered. "Linda, the casino, you know it's been." And then his eyes met my mother's eyes, and something in him shut down completely. He looked back at his hands and he was done. And I felt something in me let him go gently, for good. My mother, abandoned even by the silence that had always protected her, turned to rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me, the tears already drying because they'd never been real. "I'll fight that trust. I'll get a lawyer. You can't just take a person's home." Harold answered before I could, mild as milk. "It was never your home, Linda. It was your mother's." I gathered my page. I had one thing left to do, and it was the easiest thing of all. I stood slowly. The ribs still wouldn't allow for drama, even when the moment called for it, and I took Nora's car seat from Daniel. I held it on my lap for a second. I reached into my coat pocket, and took out the soft gray hospital band, the one I'd worn for 5 days straight, the one with my patient ID on it, the proof of where I'd been when my family decided I could wait, and I looped it once around the handle of my daughter's car seat. Let it rest there, a small, ugly piece of proof where I would see it every time I carried her. Not the bank app, not the spreadsheet, not the folder. That little band was the whole story. The night I nearly died, and my family checked a cruise schedule. My mother was still talking, threats sliding into pleas. "Paige, honey, we can fix this. We're family." But her voice had stopped being able to reach me. The way a song stops when you finally leave the room it's playing in. I turned to Aunt Carol, who'd gone pale and quiet. "Thank you for reading the numbers, Carol. I know you'll tell everyone the truth." It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, and she nodded. Then I looked at my father one last time. He met my eyes. I gave him a small nod that meant, "I understand, and it's all right, and I'm still leaving." Daniel took the diaper bag. Harold gathered his folder and his cane. And the 3 generations my mother least wanted under one roof walked back out into the cold October evening. I pulled the door shut behind us with my good hands softly, because slamming it would have meant I still wanted something from the people on the other side. I didn't. The trust held. My mother called 2 lawyers. Both told her the same thing. Harold had that clean paperwork, and a competent grantor are very hard to fight. The threats quietly stopped. She and my father still live in the house, because the trust lets them stay there for their lifetimes. I'm not in the business of putting an old man with a bad heart on the curb, whatever his silences cost me. But Black Hawk Casino no longer runs on my margin. And a casino with no fresh money is just a sad room with carpet. Megan got a job, a real one, at a marketing firm that doesn't care about her follower count. And the last I heard, she was learning slowly that a launch you fund yourself feels different than one your sister funds for you. She texted me once, months later, 3 words, "Where'd it go?" I sent her the single page. She never replied. But she never asked me for money again. Aunt Carol told everyone the truth, exactly as I knew she would. The family chat went very quiet for a long while. My father calls sometimes, but only when he's alone in his car, and I always answer those calls. Avit, the night nurse, stayed on 2 weeks while my ribs healed. She still sends Nora a birthday card every year, and Harold moved into a little rental 10 minutes from us. He comes for Sunday dinner and brings the folder every single time, sets it on my bookshelf, and says, "In case anybody forgets." If there's one thing I learned from a hospital bed, a folder, and 4 taps on a banking app, it's this. The people who praise you for being the strong one are usually just naming the person they've quietly decided they will never have to carry. And the day you stop being their bank is the day you finally get to be something better. For me? Simply a mother to my own daughter, instead of a parent to everyone who refused to grow up. That's my story. 9 years, a folder, and the truth my whole family buried. Thank you for letting me finally say it out loud.